Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I have a very special guest, Dr. Karl Friston. He is Professor of Imaging Neuroscience and Wellcome Principal Research Fellow of Imaging Neuroscience at University College London. He is a theoretical neuroscientist, and his main contribution to theoretical neurobiology has been a free energy principle for action and perception. And today we're going to focus a lot on the free energy principle and let's say what point we can get to, because there are many topics that Dr. Friston researchers that I would be interested in talking with him about today, but let's see where we can get. So Dr. Friston, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Okay, so the free energy principle. First of all, could you tell us in the simplest terms possible what the free energy principle is about? And could you tell us perhaps also a little bit about the history behind its development?
Yes, the free energy principle is in effect the physics backstory to a move in cognitive neuroscience towards understanding brain function in terms of predictive processing, and specifically the way in which we actively get information to process and to predict. And that's sometimes in my world referred to as active inference. So the free energy principle is the physicists or the mathematicians' foundation from which you can build a story about how we make sense of our world. And I repeat, how we actively engage with the world to get the right kinds of sensations to make sense of our world.
So when applied to, for example, perception and cognition, you call it active inference. Is that it?
Yep, absolutely. So active inference, which I read as synonymous with predictive processing, provided there's an active and embodied aspect to predictive processing, is an application of the free energy principle. Sometimes in explaining the free energy principle, one can take a low road or a high road. And by the low road and the high road, I mean an intuitive, teleological account of what it means to engage in active inference and predictive processing, where the high road will be the physicist's way of telling exactly the same story. So you asked for a simple explanation, so perhaps I'll go for the low road explanation, which I think you could probably start with the ideas of Plato and his students in terms of the allegorical cave, but perhaps best developed by Hermann Helmholtz, predicated on his understanding of not only physics, but of course perception in the brain as an anatomist and physiologist, possibly predicated on the ideas of Kant that were prevalent at that time. So this, if we start with Helmholtz and his notion of unconscious inference, the idea here is that we make sense of the world by internally generating a hypothesis, an explanation in our head that could best account for the sensory impressions on our ears, on our eyes, and all our sensory epithelia. So, as Andy Clark puts it, we're turning the usual conception of perception on its head. So, in the 20th century, people thought that perception was basically an outside-in process. So, sensory information impressed itself upon the sensory organs, that was registered by the brain, and somehow this sensory information was successively refined and then provided the basis for perception. The predictive processing or active inference story is exactly the other way around. the perception rests upon an inside-out process, that you're actively and constructively generating hypotheses, explanations. Sometimes you can think of these as hallucinations or fantasies that are fit for purpose in terms of explaining what I am actually encountering. And perhaps the best way of understanding that would be through the lens of predictive coding. So predictive coding is a scheme, in fact, originally invented to compress sound files in the 1950s. But more recently, over the past few decades, has become a very popular scheme for understanding how the brain works in terms of message passing and technically belief updating. And it's very simple. All that happens is that if I had an idea or a hypothesis about the cause of this pattern of visual input, say it was you and your face, then I will be able to predict what I would see if I was right. And I can compare my prediction to what I'm actually sensing. So if I am correct, then there should be no difference between my prediction and my sensations. And that difference is scored by a prediction error. So if I can eliminate or resolve prediction errors, I've got the right explanation for states of affairs in the world out there. When I say out there, what I'm implying is that the brain doesn't have direct access to the world. It can only sample it. All it has access to are very sparse sensory signals afforded by our eyes, our ears, our skin, and our body, all our sense organs. So this picture puts prediction error at the center of driving changes in our beliefs. So if we have a large prediction error, that basically means our perception, our belief, I should qualify this. When I say belief, I mean a mathematical belief, a representation, if you like, an encoding of the cause of a sensation by some neuronal activity. So if I have a belief that is not able to predict what I'm currently seeing, I can now use that prediction error to change my mind. So using the prediction error will drive belief updating until it eliminates itself. And this can be described in many ways, but has a very nice description in relation to the wiring in the brain, and in particular the sort of hierarchical structure of our brains, where there's recurrent message passing or influences between successive levels of a hierarchical brain, very much like, say, an onion. If you imagine the brain being an onion, and the surface is in receipt of all the sensory impressions, but there are layers upon layers and layers, literally giving you a very deep structure. And deep is used exactly in the sense of deep learning, for example, in machine learning. It's the hierarchical depth that's implied by this deepness. And in the brain, there are connections between one level and a deeper level, which suggest that we can understand these reciprocal or recurrent connections in terms of prediction errors being passed from a low level to a deeper level or a higher level, changing the beliefs so that the recurrent or the inside-out connections now convey the predictions that are the result of my belief updating. And the predictions come back down again, they're compared with the input from the lower levels, get the prediction error, and then that's sent forward. So you have this view of recurrent message passing in the brain, where at each level, you're trying to minimize the prediction error. And if you can do that in a hierarchical context, then you've got an apt description of the state of the world at multiple levels of abstraction, all driven by these ascending messages, ascending deep into the hierarchy that can be construed as prediction errors. So that's, if you like, the sort of I mentioned sort of a teleological explanation. So one can say the objective of the brain is to make sense of the world by finding an appropriate explanation for everything that it is currently sensing. And if you take that view and generalize it to the consequences of action, you can now tell a story whereby some of the things that you're predicting, some of the sensations you're predicting are basically reporting the state of your body. And this can be in two flavors. It can either be in terms of the state of your muscles, physically where your limbs are and how the degree to which various muscles are stretched, or it could be more autonomic. So we can only really affect the world in one of two ways. We can only act upon the world in one of two ways. We can either move a muscle, striated muscle would be those muscles that we can move volitionally, or smooth muscle means that we can secrete things, or the kind of muscles we find in the heart or the gut. But they're both, in essence, providing the brain with signals about the state of the motor system, sometimes known as the motor plant. So notice if I've now got a good prediction of what's happening in the world, that includes a prediction of what I should feel my muscles and my autonomic nervous system doing, I can then use that prediction to basically realize or make that prediction come true. And that's effectively equipping a predictive coding scheme with reflexes. So this perspective on active sensing, active prediction, active inference can be told in many different ways. For example, in robotics, it would be model predictive control. If you were a motor physiologist, you might describe it in terms of the equilibrium point hypothesis. Some people like perceptual control theory. The idea is that you specify, you predict the state of your body, and then you reflexively fulfill those predictions. And that now takes you beyond just perception, but now subsumes action under this generic imperative to minimize prediction error. And that is one way of understanding perception and action within the same frame. And then you can sort of add cognition on that, in that all this perception has to be contextualized. You have to attend to various things. You have to have the history of things that have just happened, and also crucially roll out into the future. Is certainly, if you want to make predictions about your behavior that unfolds in terms of policies and plans and narratives of what's going to happen to me, what should I do, given I have some predictions about the consequences of acting in this way, acting in that way. And the link to the free energy principle is that, roughly speaking, the total amount of prediction error can be regarded as free energy from the point of view of a theorist, an information theorist or a physicist. So the free energy of the free energy principle is effectively scoring the prediction error, the overall prediction error, or the implausibility that if I was right, if my model of the world as it is at the moment was correct, then I'm going to want to that if it was correct, then the probability of getting these sensory data will be very high, and the free energy scores the negative log probability of these data given a particular model of those data, sometimes known as surprise. So you can see immediately that sort of prediction error scores also, or reflects, the surprise. Technically surprisal. Again, if you're doing information theory, the mathematical description of this is called self-information. And that's important because, from the point of view of the physicist, thinking about self-organizing systems like you and me, but also like macromolecules and viruses, possibly even to biospheres, then The minimization of prediction error means the minimization of surprise, which means the minimization of self-information. And the key thing here is that the average of the self-information is also known as entropy, which means that self-organization of this inactive sort, where the system is actually acting upon the world to realize its predictions, basically means you're resisting the natural tendency of systems to increase in their entropy, to decay, to dissipate, to die, to become more disordered. So things that self-organize according to the free energy principle resist this entropic erosion. If you're a physiologist, it's just a statement of homeostasis. It just means that I've got certain predictions that I should be, say, at a particular temperature. And if I sense that my temperature is deviating from these predictions, then that is surprising. In a non-propositional sense, it entails a prediction error because my prediction and my sensation are now not in accord. And if I now act in a way to eliminate that prediction error, I will act in a way that brings my temperature back towards my preferred homeostatic set point. So there are lots of ways of telling this story, depending upon whether you're a physiologist or whether you're an economist or a ethologist. But they all basically speak to the importance of having a model of the world that prescribes certain behaviors so that you can sample the world so that everything is unsurprising from your point of view, given the kind of thing that you are. I'll just conclude with a couple of key points. I'm talking about a model very deliberately, because at the heart of this is the notion of a generative model that can generate the predictions. So this perspective places center stage the notion of an agent or anything that has some kind of sentient behavior. It means that you can always describe the behavior of this kind of thing in terms of the agent or the system having a generative model that can generate predictions, which it actively pursues and tries to fulfill. So the notion of a generative model brings us exactly back to the low road discussion, in the sense that I have models, hypotheses, explanations in my mind, so that I'm actively revising through this process of Bayesian belief updating, another way of describing this, in order to realize my predictions given my model of the world that effectively I am. Everything that defines my characteristics, sensations, and exchange with the world can be described as a generative model. The final point, just to explain why terms people might come across if they read this literature, particularly the philosophical literature. It so happens that surprise, that self-information, which mathematically is the negative logarithm of the probability of my sensory data given my model or given me, is also known as the negative log evidence. And the evidence is the evidence for your model of the world, which means you can describe active inference and this active sampling of the data to minimize free energy or prediction error as exactly the same as gathering evidence for your model of the world, sometimes referred to as self-evidencing. So that's something that Jacob Howe has promoted, which I think is a very neat summary of this kind of explanation. We're just in the game of gathering evidence for our model of the lived or possibly sensed world.
No, it is a great summary. And before we delve deeper into the cognitive science and the neuroscience of it, because there are also a few concepts there or terms that you use that I would like you to explain a little bit better, like, for example, generative models, autonomous states, hierarchical organization. Before we get into all of that, let's go step by step here. So one concept that I would like you to explain to people who are not familiar with the free energy principle is, what are Markov blankets?
Right. That was the one thing that I didn't include in my long introduction. Well spotted. Right. So the physics story, the free energy principle, has to derive the self-evidencing I've just described, the predictive processing I have just described from first principles. So how does one do that? It's relatively straightforward, although it does involve some esoteric maths if you're not a physicist. But the arguments are quite straightforward. You basically start by asking the question: if you want to talk about self-organization, what is a self? And that's quite a deep question. So the first thing you realize is that you have to be able to mathematically, in a principled way, individuate the states of the self from everything else that is not the self. How would you do that? Well, as a physicist, you can't assume that the self is closed. So you can't assume the kind of physics that you would have been taught at school, where there is an equilibrium in a closed system. So, for example, the second law of thermodynamics only applies to closed systems where there is no openness of the self to the environment, to the eco-niche, to other selves. So we're now talking about the physics of open systems. And in so doing, we have to now distinguish the states of a self, or anything basically, from everything else or nothing. And that's where the Markov blanket comes into play. So the Markov blanket is a set of states that intervene between the states that are internal to, let's call it an agent. It could be anything, it could be any self, let's call it an agent. But it could be a particle, it could be a person, it could be a population, but we'll call it an agent. So the Markov blanket is a way of drawing a boundary around the states that are internal to the agent, that separates the internal states from the external states. And the external states are now the environment. And the Markov blanket, very much in the same way we were talking about before, that the brain is in the darkness of the skull and only has access to the environment through the sensory impressions. So the Markov blanket contains all the sensory impressions that the external states provide on the blanket. These are our sensations, and then those sensory states that are part of the boundary of the blanket then affect the internal states of the neuronal activity. But the Markov blanket also contains those states that mediate the influence of the inside on the outside, and they're referred to as active states. So you've got this notion that there's a set of states, the internal states, say of my brain. I've got my external states, the rest of the universe, and then there are the boundary or the blanket states. This is a Markov blanket, and they're split into two. So, and the sensory states mediate the effects of the outside on the inside, and the active states mediate the effects of the inside on the outside. So this is the physics, and the Markov blanket has a very particular definition. It simply means that the sensory states cannot be influenced by the internal states, and the active states cannot be influenced by the external states. So let me try and make that even simpler. If you were a systems theorist, you would define any given system. So now our agent is now a system in terms of its inputs and outputs. And the active and sensory states are just the outputs and the inputs of a particular system. So it's a way of defining a system or an agent in terms of its relationship to everything else through its inputs and outputs. And the Markov blanket condition requires that the inputs to a system cannot be affected by the system that is being into which the inputs are being supplied. Similarly, the outputs of a system can't be influenced by the external states that are receiving that output. And with that very, very simple rule or definition of something, an agent or a system, in terms of Markov blankets, you can then show that there is always a description of the observable aspects of the system, which are just the blanket state. So you can never see inside. You observing me means that all you can see are my blanket states, my surface, my boundary, and usually you can only see the consequences of my action. Given those conditions and the existence of a Markov blanket, it is then fairly straightforward to show mathematically that the internal states and the active states have to minimize free energy if the system has some characteristic states, and it has to have characteristic states, otherwise it wouldn't have a Markov blanket. So what you're saying is that anything that exists in the sense of possessing a Markov blanket or a boundary that persists over a certain amount of time can always be described as self-evidencing, can always be described as if it is engaging in some kind of active inference, sense-making and acting on the basis of that sense-making. So the Markov blanket is absolutely crucial because that's where the story starts, really. And it takes you beyond physics as we know and love it, in the sense that this description of the dynamics of something or an agent is in terms of the internal states holding mathematical or probabilistic beliefs about external states. So this is quite unique to the free energy principle. Normally, when people talk about probability distributions, they're talking about a probability distribution over some states. When you're talking about the free energy principle and what some people refer to as the Bayesian mechanics that ensues, you're talking now truly about beliefs encoded by the internal states about something. So it's information beyond Shannon. It is truly representational beliefs. And I introduced the notion of Bayesian mechanics because just to reassure you that the maths that underwrites the Bayesian mechanics is exactly the same maths that you will find in quantum mechanics, in statistical mechanics, and in classical mechanics. It's all the same maths. The only difference or the only special thing required by the Bayesian mechanics is the existence of this separation, the Markov blanket that separates the states of something from the states that are not part of the thing in question.
And is it possible to determine precisely where the boundary or the Markov blanket is located and how we separate internal states from external states?
Yes, with a formal and mathematically crisp definition, yes, it is. So, and there are, if you like, numerical studies illustrating how you can identify Markov blankets given some data. I have colleagues in academia and in industry working on Markov blanket discovery algorithms. So it certainly is possible, and what you're basically looking for is an absence of influence or coupling. That it's this sparsity that emerges from, that underpins Markov blankets. And interestingly, in some work by my friend Dalton shows that for any technically any random dynamical system with sparse coupling, there will always be, with probability one or more Markov blankets in any system. So these are not remarkable things. It can be no other way for any random dynamical system that has that persists. It doesn't sort of diverge exponentially into nothing. As long as it persists and has technically what's called a pullback attractor, then you will have Markov blankets. Having said that, you have to pick the scale and the internal states to define the Markov blanket. So there's not one Markov blanket. There are a possibly countably large number of Markov blankets. And you can have Markov blankets within Markov blankets. You can have Markov blankets of Markov blankets. So you have to, if you actually wanted to identify a Markov blanket, and there are lots of good reasons why you might want to do that, you really have to specify the scale at which you're doing it. So if you were a molecular biologist, the Markov blanket, or a cellular biologist, you might draw a Markov blanket around a particular cell of interest. If you were a cognitive neuroscientist, you might draw it around the brain. If you were a theoretical biologist interested in evolution, you might draw it around a species. If you were doing climate change, you might draw it around certain aspects of the biosphere. So, and each one of these Markov blankets would contextualize all the smaller Markov blankets within it and at different scales. So I'm trying to emphasize there is no one Markov blanket, but as soon as you identify something, then it must by definition have a Markov blanket. So if it is a natural kind, then it must have a Markov blanket just to describe it. So a cell has a Markov blanket, a organ has a Markov blanket, a set of organs, a phenotype has a Markov blanket, a family has a Markov blanket, a community, a population. They all have their inputs and outputs. And I repeat, because you've got a very precise specification of what it means, how you define the Markov blanket, all you have to do is to identify the sparse coupling. You just have to identify what is not influenced by what. And once you've done that, there are easy mathematical recipes for identifying the Markov blanket. Just for your entertainment, the Markov blanket of any given state or set of states is effectively the parents of, by which I mean those things that influence, the parents of your internal states. The children, which are your active states, the things that you influence, the things that the internal states influence, and the parents of the children. So if you think about the two rules I said, that the sensory states cannot be influenced by the internal states and the active states cannot be influenced by the external states, then the complete set of parents and children and parents of the children are just the blanket states. It is the sensory states and the active states. So you can identify that using matrix algebra, dynamical systems theory, or you can infer that by using Markov blanket discovery algorithms.
But there's a bidirectional interaction between the internal states and the external states, correct?
Absolutely, and that is a key construct that the Markov blanket brings to the table. You've got this sort of boundary that allows you to say, no, these are the states of the agent or the system in question, and these are the states of the environment or the external states, but they are bidirectionally coupled. So the system is vicariously open to everything else, but only through this two-way street, which is the Markov blanket. And and that reciprocal aspect that you foregrounded there is really important. And that's just why I made such a big point about saying there are sensory and active parts of the Markov blanket, sometimes referred to as sectors. And I say that because you can think of the Markov blanket in terms of inputs and outputs, but you can also apply quantum information theory, and people like Chris Fields have done this, and then the Markov blanket becomes something known as a holographic screen. And the holographic principle says that all the information that is accessible from an observer from the outside about the internal states on the other side of the holographic screen is available on the holographic screen. So that's what I was intimating before. When when I'm looking at you, I'm basically looking at your Markov blanket or your holographic screen at the scale that that we are actually communicating.
So if we want to talk about causality here, would there be a circular causality between the internal states and the external states? Is that it?
Yes. Yep. That is another really important point. Yes. So first of all, just to be very clear and precise about causality in this framework. So this framework, the free energy principle, always stays very close to the physics. So causality here is very, very clear. It is basically the influence of one state on another state that is expressed in time, usually expressed in terms of a stochastic differential equation, which would be one way of writing down a random dynamical system, such as, say, a Langevin system. So we're using causality in a mathematical sense that could also be read as in a control theoretic sense. I cause changes in you simply by having an influence in you. So it is that causal structure that defines the Markov blanket. Now notice there is another whole universe of causality which does not rest upon control theory or dynamical systems theory or random dynamical systems. The free energy principle is not interested in that kind of causality. It's just interested in exactly the kind of causality that underwrites the Markov blanket. And simply because we've got these bidirectional influences, causal inferences, you're absolutely right, there's circular causality. And that circular causality just is the action perception cycle. And that becomes really important when you think about two agents or an ensemble of agents all communicating with each other or coupled through their own Markov boundaries or Markov blankets with each other. No one system causes the others. They all cause each other. And you even see that within, let's come back to this notion of the brain as a hierarchical generative model. Then the hierarchies are defined by their Markov blankets. So you've got nested Markov blankets in the brain. And we were saying before that one functional architecture that is necessary, not that is necessary in terms of the Markov blanket, but also necessary to understand the predicted coding, is the sort of the ascending and descending messages, predictions and prediction errors. So again, you've got circular causality. Does the prediction cause a prediction error, or does the prediction error revise your prediction? So circular causality wherever you look.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps this is a good point to introduce then another concept. What is an autonomous state?
An autonomous state in the context of a Markov blanket partition is just a description of those states that can be described as minimizing free energy. And very simply, they're just the internal states and the active states. So mathematically, it's just those states, those states of a particular agent that can be described as if they are minimizing prediction error or free energy. So the nice thing about having that split of autonomous states into internal states and active states, then you can say that it must be the case that the internal states are minimizing free energy, so it looks as if they're minimizing their prediction error, so it looks as if they are doing perception, while the active states, which are the other part of the autonomous states, are also minimizing exactly the same quantity, which is the prediction error, but in this instance, in the predictions of the felt body. technically the proprioceptive or interoceptive predictions. And of course, that's just action. So again, you've got a nice, if you like, a common framework or a first principle account that ties together action and perception through a common application of the free energy principle to those states to which the free energy principle applies, which are just the internal states and the active states. So notice the sensory states don't do that. The sensory states don't minimize prediction error because they are influenced by the external states. But the active states, by construction, are only influenced, they're not influenced by the external states. And the internal states are not influenced directly by the external states because they're hidden behind or sequestered by the Markov blanket. So the autonomous states, the active states, and the internal states are unique in the sense that they are not directly influenced or caused by external states. And that, that then leads you to this interpretation in terms of inference, in terms of the internal states holding beliefs about the external states and using those beliefs to predict how they're going to act upon the world.
Mm-hmm. You've already explained here more or less how this framework might apply to different kinds of systems, but how do we get to living systems? I mean, what is the difference between a living system and a non-living system?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think probably best tackled from the point of view of the free energy principle. So you've got this this description of any kind of particle, any kind of thing, in terms of its Markov blanket partition. Now, that means that there are different kinds of things. And your question, I think, is at what point would you call this particle living or biotic? And at which point would it take on the attribute that would associate with agency and possibly sentience? So we just work through it. Again, it's relatively straightforward. So we can have things where the active sector of the Markov blanket is empty. So we're talking about things that cannot act upon the world. They can still sense the world, they can still be affected by the universe, but they can't act. So, one might imagine a rock on the moon, for example, or something that does not have not have a full complement of autonomous states, in the sense that if the autonomous states are the internal states and the active states, if they don't have the active states, they can't move. So you wouldn't call these kinds of inert systems or inert particles living. Would you call them living if they were able to move? Basically, active states that express themselves by acting upon the environment. We were just talking about things that move, effectively, in a classical context. And things that move in a way that depends on and only on the internal states and not the external states. So there'll be another definition of autonomous dynamics. Then I think you're probably getting closer to biological self-organization or biotic self-organization. Is it living at this point? Probably not. There's an extra, if you like, condition that you would probably want to apply before you would say that this is biotic or biological self-organization. And that is the precision or the reproducibility of the movement. So if something is very, very small, it usually comes along with lots of random fluctuations. So usually things fluctuate very quickly. They have a higher temperature from the point of view of statistical mechanics when they're very, very small. And in the limit of quantum physics, it's all random, effectively, or occurring so quickly you can't measure it. So you can only describe it in terms of probability distributions. But living things have characteristic states that they keep on revisiting, that you can recognize when in a life form, simply because there is some systematic revisiting of certain states. And that tells you two things about self-organization of a biological sort or a living sort. It tells you that they have to be realized in systems that are sufficiently large for the random fluctuations to be averaged away. So you won't find living things at the quantum level, but you may find it at the level of, say, a virus, and you'll certainly find it at the level of a cell as you get to sort of, hundreds of microns or even millimeters. And when you get to something our size, then if something our size moves around of its own accord because it has active states that are driven by internal, so you'll say yes, that is certainly living. So size really does matter. The scale really does matter, I think. And the reason that scale is so important is as things get bigger, all the random fluctuations disappear and things get much more precise in terms of their dynamics, their flow. But the other interesting aspect of this, and interestingly, this inherits from the physics work of Helmholtz when he was trying to understand the flow of systems, say, for example, turbulence in water. Is there any way that you can sort of classify the dynamics or the flow or the movement of states in some abstract state space? And the Helmholtz decomposition says, yes, you can divide things into those flows that try to minimize their energy. And for us in basic mechanics, this is the variational free energy. In classical mechanics, it would be things like gravity. In thermodynamics, it'd be things like potential energy. So systems can be described in terms of their flows. So I'm using flows and dynamics interchangeably here. So the flow can be split into two parts. The first part is known as a dissipative flow, and it's that which can be described as flowing downhill, like literally water flowing down a valley or down a potential gradient. And that dissipative aspect underwrites a lot of statistical mechanics in terms of fluctuation dissipation theorems, and a lot of the sort of rhetoric surrounding statistical mechanics like heat and work all speaks to the way in which heat is dissipated or work is with work due to this kind of flow. But there's another kind of flow. So if you imagine a valley and you've got flows down the valley, and these flows are equipped with random fluctuations, so you never settle at the bottom of the valley. Because as soon as you get there, there'll be some random fluctuation that pushes you away. So there'll be a little regime at the bottom of the valley that you have flown down into, and then you're perturbed by the random fluctuations. That's thermodynamic equilibrium, and that will be the dissipative physics that the statistical mechanics is based on. But there's another really important kind of flow which emerges in non-equilibrium systems, and that's flow around the isocontours, around the rim or any given level of the bowl. So this conserves the energy or the height of the bowl, so it's called conservative mechanics, and this is really important. So in the limit that things get very, 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 very big, the random fluctuations are almost zero. And so what do you see? You just see this conservative flow. Like, for example, the motion of a heavenly body, like the moon, orbits. Now, these things have a certain aspect which brings us back to what we're talking about before in terms of biological self-organization, which is revisiting states that you were once in, characteristic states that you sometimes wander away from with an itinerant trajectory, but you'll always come back again. So in the limit of being very, very big, much bigger than you and me, then we now conform to conservative mechanics, and we have this circular flow. This is sometimes known as solenoidal flow as well. And you can read about that if you look at basic descriptions of things like fluid mechanics. But that decomposition or variance of it holds for any kind of state, including the states that comprise the Markov blanket partition into internal blanket states and external states. And this, to my mind, is so important, because what it says is, if the random fluctuations are sufficiently small that I can see the solenoidal flow, what that means is things of a certain scale will always revisit states that they were once in. And then you just think about this at different scales. What you are talking about is either very, very fast oscillations, for example, in your brain cells, or they could be the cardiac cycle going around these itinerant orbits, just like the moon, but much more complicated now, and slightly fuzzy because you're sufficiently small to actually have random fluctuations there. It could be walking. It could be my sleep-wake cycle. It could, in fact, be reproduction and replication at an evolutionary scale. At every scale, you've got this characteristic solenoidal dynamics, this conservative aspect that I think is definitive of biological self-organization. So essentially, things that have biorhythms and life cycles mean that, well, put it another way, if living things have evinced biorhythms and life cycles, then that means that they must belong to a certain class of things at a particular scale. They have to be bigger than the quantum scale, but to be sufficiently itinerant, they have to be smaller than the cosmological scale. We can go on if you wanted to. There's one final kind of thing that has this conservative aspect, this solenoidal aspect to it, and that's when the dynamics become very, very precise, which means that you can effectively roll out into the future. And if you can roll out into the future, that means not only can you predict the state at the moment that this system is in, but the long-term future. And if if you can predict the long-term future, it will look as though certain kinds of things like you and me plan into the future. We have intentions, and I think now we're getting very close to life forms with agency. So, to cut a long story short, so the answer to your question is yes, there are certainly different kinds of physical systems at different scales with different degrees of random fluctuations and different kinds of dynamics. And I would posit that life is basically a special kind of thing that would subsume things that are properly agential in the sense that they plan, and some things that are not. I don't think viruses plan, whereas I do think, say, bees and you and I plan into the future. But we are quite special. We're in a Goldilocks regime between being very, very small and being very, very big.
So would this framework help us deal with questions surrounding what separates exactly the organic from the inorganic, and particular kinds of entities like viruses? Because viruses in particularly are people debate a lot about whether they are living systems or non-living systems, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly use this framework to happily accommodate the vagueness. And I'm using vagueness now in a philosophical sense. How many grains of sand make a pile of sand? So at what point would a virus be called living? When it was sufficiently big or complicated? You can certainly locate a vague notion of living versus non-living, and even to I think to a certain extent, agents versus non-agents, or sentient versus non-sentient, on this space afforded by the Markov blanket and implicitly the free energy principle. Absolutely. Could you draw bright lines between um, I think you possibly could draw some bright lines. You know, for example, you could say, well, in the limit that the random fluctuations disappear on the inside, that might be a bright line between things that are biotic and not biotic. That's not to say that so a virus would certainly be biotic. It would have recognizable states and trajectories and character, and it would have this solenoidal aspect. It will have a life cycle. It will survive in a particular eco niche, so usually intracellular one. But you wouldn't necessarily say it was living. So you then ask, well, what does it have to? What does it mean to live? And in particular, what does it mean to? I think to be an agent in a sort of in the sense that there is that kind of anthropomorphic agency and autonomy. And I think that the bright line there is that the system can be described as if it has a generative model of the consequences of its own active states. I think that possibly is a bright line that helps basically give you an ontology of different kinds of things. And so I'm now appealing to, if you recall at the beginning, I was setting up the notion of a generative model as foundational. So the generative model is just basically a description of a probabilistic description of the characteristic states of the thing in question. And if your generative model is such that it includes paths into the future, and because the future is caused because of the circular causality you mentioned before, which is acting upon the world, then implicitly you've got a generative model, or at least your internal dynamics can be described as having an internal model of the consequences of your action in the future. And at that point, I think you're starting to talk about minimal agency, not minimal selfhood. This kind of system doesn't know it's an agent, but it now has a minimal kind of agency in the sense it represents the consequences of its actions and can be understood or read as selecting among a number of different actions and choosing the one that is most probable for the kind of thing that it is. So yeah, I think I'm not quite sure where a virus would. The virus would not plan. So it's certainly biotic. Is it an agent? No. Is a thermostat an agent? Probably not.
So earlier you've talked about the need to reduce prediction errors, and in your work you talk about existential imperatives. What is an existential imperative in this particular context? What does that mean?
It's just another way of putting a teleological understanding or description on the physics backstory. So in the same way that you can describe the behavior of anything in terms of self-evidencing, which we rehearsed in terms of gathering evidence from my model of the world, existential imperatives are what it would look like to be something. So the free energy principle actually turns this on its head and says, if you exist in the sense of possessing a Markov blanket, which itself implies or entails a set of attracting or characteristic states that is the generative model, that is the pullback attractor when described, that is the pullback attractor that when described probabilistically is the generative model. That means if you exist, you will look as if you are conforming to certain imperatives, namely minimizing your prediction error or your free energy. So the minimization of free energy is a consequence of existing. I exist, therefore I can be described as thinking and inferring and perceiving and acting. But you can sort of turn that on its head and say, if you wanted to, you're licensed to tell a much more teleological functionalist story. That to exist, I must infer, I must perceive and act. I must have a generative model of my lived world in order to act sensibly in that world. So that's the genesis of the existential imperative, that if I do not minimize my free energy, then I cannot exist. It's a sleight of hand. It's slightly cheeky because the physics says the other way around. The physics says that if you exist, then you can always be described as minimizing, of conforming to the, looking as if you are minimizing your free energy. So that means you can be described as, if you like, optimizing something, extremizing something, complying with a principle of least action, which means that you can, it looks as if you are complying with an imperative to minimize, to minimize your free energy. Just for people who not familiar with the principle of least action. Action here, as in, is read as time times free energy. So it's technically it's the area under the curve as you move forward in time. But the Bayesian mechanics just is a principle of least action in exactly the same way that Hamilton's principle of least action just describes the motion of massive bodies. All we're doing here is describing the motion or the dynamics of internal states in terms of them holding beliefs about external states and then acting upon them. But it's the same, exactly the same kind of maths.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to get now a little bit more into nervous systems and the brain, but there's another concept that you touched on briefly earlier that I think it's important for you to explain a bit better, just for people to understand what we're going to talk about here. So what is self-organization, and specifically biological self-organization?
Well, self-organization is a term usually used by physicists to describe how systems, how the dynamics of systems bring about particular states. And it's effectively what we have just been talking about. I mean, I've slipped in some technical words like pullback attractors. So you want to understand the physics, or more specifically the mechanics behind the propensity or the existence of certain systems that seem to be drawn to certain attracting states. So the simplest example of that is equilibrium physics. Why is it that things cool down? Why is it that you can? Why do we have the second law? Why do things settle to a free energy minimum when isolated from the world, when they're closed systems? So the physics of closed systems is just a way of writing down the physics or the laws, literally the equations of motion of states that describe the behavior of things that are isolated, and they just settle down to the lowest energy point. When one moves to systems that are now open, that also now induces the circular causality you were picking up on before, then one now moves to self-organization in the context of non-equilibrium. So non-equilibrium physics, because there are no equilibria anymore because of this circular causality. And then what one is aspiring to understand is the ability or the existence of certain systems that have what can be described as a non-equilibrium steady state, which is just a way of saying that if I wait long enough, my system will confine itself to a set of characteristic states, and it will never leave those states, or do so just probabilistically or very sporadically. That's the attracting set. That's the pullback attractor. So you want to understand, how do things converge upon their their attracting states, their characteristic states. And characteristic states here is just a euphemism for being a member of this attracting set that is characteristic of me. And you can actually score it with a characteristic function. The characteristic function is 1 if I'm in one of my characteristic states, and 0 if I'm not, if I'm the wrong temperature, or in 2 pieces, or anything else that would be inconsistent and violate those existential imperatives. So self-organization, is an umbrella term that starts to get really interesting, certainly in physics, when you're talking about non-equilibria and open systems.
And how does it apply specifically in the case of nervous systems? What does it mean for a nervous system to be self-organizing?
Well, self-organization, strictly speaking, can be applied to any system that possesses these characteristic states. But of course, the most interesting for people like you and me is the nervous system. But the principles should be exactly the same. So the self-organization usually is manifest at a number of different scales, and at each scale you're basically looking for an explanation which, from the point of view of the free energy principle, is a minimization of free energy, but at different scales. So at a very fast scale, well, actually, no, let's start off with very large scales and then sort of winnow down. So at an evolutionary time scale, we are now looking for processes, self-organizing processes, where speciation is a self-organizing phenomena at the level of evolution itself, and things like adaptive fitness, and indeed the definition of a species entails a persistence over time with characteristic states, characteristic phenotypic states. So what kind of Bayesian mechanics would you be looking at if you were applying the free energy principle? Well, you'd be looking at those free energy minimizing processes that have this notion of selecting the good phenotypes that are a good match, minimum prediction error with their environment. In statistics, this is known as Bayesian model selection. So selecting a number of different generative models, which we can now read as the phenotype. So before, say, I am my generative model, I am seeking evidence for my own existence because I am seeking evidence for my model, and I am my model. So now I can label each phenotype, each baby, as a model, and I can score the adaptive fitness of that model in terms of that baby's over the lifetime. We can take the free energy over the lifetime, or the path interval, the free action, and that would be adaptive fitness. So now you've got Bayesian model selection now is just natural selection. So evolution is nature's way of doing Bayesian model selection to select the free energy minimizing generative model with her Markov blanket that is the phenotype. What does that mean from the point of view of neurodevelopment at a slightly sort of faster time scale? Well, it means that the model that I've inherited from my genotype and my parents, and this Bayesian model selection over millennia, means that I can now learn my environment quickly and efficiently in an adaptive way, in a free energy minimizing way. Also, it means that my environment is actually built to be learnable. So the self-organization that you'd expect to see during neurodevelopment, say development of the brain in utero, and then crucially during early developmental periods, is basically a selection of the neuronal elements and systems and connectivity, the connectome, that is fit for purpose to provide a good generative model of this phenotype, of this infant's world, where this world is carefully crafted by the mother, by school, by carers, by teachers, to make it as learnable as possible. And then you'd be asking, if you're a neurobiologist, what are the mechanisms of this? Well, there are all sorts of levels at which you can study this, from sort of epigenetic specification and of neurodevelopment right through to experience-dependent plasticity, where neurons or brain cells that wire together fire together. This itself is a free energy minimizing process. It's also known as Hebbian plasticity, and effectively the connectivity as it grows. Well, interestingly, in fact, we're usually born with too many connections. It's a bit like being a large language model that we have to actually prune. So it's actually a question of to the right level of sparsity. So we actually lose redundant connections as we grow up and become old and wise and sparse in our much simpler and more efficient generative model. But irrespective of that, all of this can be written down as effectively learning in exactly the same way that machine learning uses recurrent neural networks to identify the best weights that best explain the content to which this recurrent neural network was exposed. For example, a large language model. So this would be plasticity of a developmental sort, but also experience-dependent plasticity that we still enjoy today. We can still learn to drive a car when we're quite old, or you can now go off and learn a new sport, or you could run away from fires in a way that you've never done before. So we still have this capacity to learn, and we also have the capacity to revise the very structure of our models of the kind that is prescribed epigenetically at birth. When we go to sleep at night, for example, we are eliminating certain synaptic connections that are redundant, that have accumulated through experience-dependent plasticity during the day. So this is self-organization over a time scale of years developmentally, days in terms of the sleep-wake cycle, and hours in terms of learning a new skill. And then we go to a faster level of self-organization, which would be framed now not in terms of hours, but in terms of milliseconds and seconds. And this would be the kind of self-organization that would be appropriate for describing the dynamics, not neuroplasticity, not the efficacy or the strength of neural connections, but the natural activity, the neural activity, the dynamics themselves, the amount to which brain cells are spiking or shouting or trying to influence each other through message passing and depolarization events. And this is the inference part, this is the perception and the active part. So what is this kind of self-organization? Well, we've just said it's neuronal dynamics that can be described in terms of this Bayesian mechanics that can be read as perception and action, changing your mind in the moment to predict, accommodate, and to realize predictions about the sensorium, given the way that you are sampling your sensorium. And then you get into the world of cognitive neuroscience, event-related potentials, and things that change very, very quickly. So we've moved away from learning and ethology into the world of self-organization over milliseconds. There's an interesting intermediate scale, which I just slip in, which I think makes us intelligent and cognitive, which is being able to recognize the context, infer the context you are in, and make short-term adjustments to the connectivity that it has been learned. And this is often framed in terms of representation of uncertainty or confidence or precision ascribed to different sources of evidence. In psychology, it would be attention. So this is not actually recognizing or inferring the particular content at the moment or in the future, but the context in which, the ability that your brain has to recognize you're in the dark and therefore make appropriate adjustments in terms of pupillary dilatation, sort of adapt your photoreceptors in a way that knows that there's a different dynamic range at hand. So being in the dark provides a context that outlives in time the very fast sense making we get from, say, visually evoked responses. I mentioned that because that's quite important. Attention is quite important when it comes to talking about things like sentience and phenomenal experience and possibly mental action. Because if you've got the ability to recognize the context in which you're making sense, it may be that a higher level of the brain in this deep architecture is able to now act upon lower levels to say it's in this context you're doing your predictive coding, or it's in that context, and now you've got the notion of action on the inside, not just through moving your bodies, and that mental action, which I repeat, could be just optimizing or seen as optimizing your intentional set, or in the active domain your intentional set, may be an important, if you like, facility that thermostats don't have, and possibly insects don't have, but certainly you and I have this sort of fast but not very fast scale of self-organization, coordinating things in a 300 milliseconds through to several seconds, for example.
Mm-hmm. And still on the topic of nervous systems and the brain more specifically, earlier you mentioned another concept that I said I would need to ask you more about. What is hierarchy in this context? What does it mean for the brain to be hierarchical?
Right, so again, that's an excellent question. So hierarchy simply means that there are separable levels or scales of something, and implicitly lots of things, because there's things at every scale. So from the point of view of a physicist, there's another kind of circular causality which you'll find in non-equilibrium physics, and in particular the synergetics of the sort that Hermann Haken is famous for, was famous for. He unfortunately died very recently. So this circular causality is a circular causality between scales, and you think of this as a sort of a hierarchical ladder. So the hierarchy, very much as in an organization or in a caste system, means that there is a certain ordering. So you can be low in the hierarchy or high in the hierarchy. And this hierarchical structure always exists in the universe, simply because you can take small, fast fluctuations at any given scale and take the averages of these. And then what happens is that the fast stuff gets averaged away, and you're left with slightly slower, larger scale things. So you've got a representation of the fast stuff at the lowest at any given level, and then at the higher level, there things slow down. They are, if you like, caused by or subtended by the fast things, simply because the fast things are added together to create the slow things. So, but at the same time, the slow things provide a context for the fast things. And this is the kind of circular causality celebrated in synergetics. And that providing the context means that you can write down mathematically, akin to things like the center manifold theorem, a notion that the slow things at the higher scale enslave the fast fluctuations to particular manifolds on which the slow things operate. And you repeat that. You can rinse, wash, and repeat. Now you've got the slow things that can cells be averaged to make even slower things. And if it is a case, as it probably is, and certainly from the point of view of the free energy principle, it is relatively easy to show it is the case. If it is the case that the dynamics, the functional form of the dynamics expressed as a Lagrangian or in terms of the equations of motion, are conserved over scales, with different scaling properties, but the functional form is the same. You have something called the renormalization group. So what that means is that the world out there has this hierarchical structure where slow things contextualize and enslave fast things, and the fast things effectively are coarse-grained in order to summarize and create the slow things. So this is a circular causality that emerges from the slaving principle in physics. Why is that interesting? Well, remember before, the free energy principle says that an existential imperative is to have a good generative model of your lived world. And by good, it just basically means that the probability of the data being provided by, or the sensory input being provided by this world is very high under your model, which means that you have to have a good model of the world. Because I'm using that expression with a nod to an acknowledgement of things like the good regulator theorem and the law of requisite variety that was established in the early days of cybernetics. And what this basically says is that if I am in open exchange with my environment, and if I can control and measure, if I can act upon and sense my environment, in the language of the good regulator theorem, if I can regulate this environment, then I have to be a good model of that environment. So this is just another statement of the free energy principle, in the sense that to be a good model means that my model evidence is very high, and if I maximize my model evidence, I'm implicitly minimizing my surprise or my free energy. But we've said that the world has to have a hierarchical structure, which means that my brain, as a good model of this world, has to have a hierarchical structure. So what would that look like? Well, it would look like effectively bits of the brain sitting very close to the sensory input, responding very, very quickly to what's going on. And then there would be a level above it, a level above another part of the brain, a brain system, that's looking at the level below as if it was the sensorium, as if it was the sensory interface, as if it was the Markov blanket. And indeed, and then you've got a third level or scale that's looking at the second level, and it's enacting in this in the spirit of the renormalization group. It's doing exactly the same thing. In fact, it's doing predictive coding, which is minimizing free energy. That is the Lagrangian in this instance. So that gives you a view of the brain as basically layer upon layer, very much like that onion analogy we had before, where each layer is trying to make sense of the layer towards the outside, the lower layer, the layer or the level that is closer to the fast sensory fluctuations that are provided by vision or hearing or interoception. And making sense of means being able to predict veridically and simply, in the spirit of minimizing or maximizing model evidence or minimizing free energy. And that basically can always be read as providing a simple account that is accurate of what's going on at the level below. And I use that language because the simplicity is important here, in the sense that the model evidence, let's put it the other way, the free energy can always be expressed as complexity minus accuracy. So if I want to minimize my free energy or maximize my model evidence or minimize my prediction error or minimize my surprise, I'm effectively trying to find the minimally complex explanation that retains an accurate account. So I'm always trying to simplify, I'm always trying to compress, I'm always trying to dimension reduce, I'm always trying to summarize coarse grain without losing accuracy. So it's lossy compression, but the least lossy in terms of the amount of information. So this notion of compression is really important, because this is where a lot of people think about the existential imperatives can also be seen not as minimizing prediction error, but just by compressing just abstracting, coarse graining away what really matters in describing what's really going on at increasingly longer and larger spatial scales. So as you ascend the hierarchy in the brain, as you move deeper into the brain in terms of this onion analogy, then you see more of the surface. So, after a certain depth, there will be brain systems that are multimodal. They will be receiving, say, prediction errors from the visual brain, from the hearing brain, from the interoceptive brain, from the proprioceptive brain. They will be multimodal. They will be amodal. They will be domain general. And furthermore, because this scaling, as we were emphasizing when describing the slaving principle, the compression will be into slower and slower narratives. So receptive fields in, say, the visual cortex at the back of the brain, at the very lowest hierarchical level, V1, primary visual cortex, they just see a very small part of the visual scene, and they respond to very little transient changes, little bars, very, very quickly. And indeed, if you go right down to the brain stem, you're talking about sort of very fast processing, in less than 100 milliseconds. But as you get out, say, to the prefrontal cortex or intermediate parietal cortex, then you start to get notions of things moving, so visual motion, which means that something has to move for a period of time before you can actually estimate, how fast this thing is moving. Is it a bird or is it an aeroplane? Meaning that the spatial temporal receptive fields increase in size, crucially in time as well. So you might argue that when you get to very high levels, say hippocampus, you've got whole narratives lasting, encoding, where I've been and where I'm going, seconds into the future. So this would be, so that would be the implication of having a world which has this renormalizing structure, which it always has to have different levels of description. How that hierarchical structure gets installed into the neuroanatomy of a brain that has this increasingly deep, slow, compressed representation of a narrative self that transcends any given moment. So there is no present. We're just representing things that are unfolding very, very, very slowly. So perhaps language is a good example here. The primary auditory cortex will be perfectly attuned and respond to a particular frequency glide. Then there will be sort of periauditory cortices that may respond to phonemes. The higher levels that may start responding to words and the lexical structure of words. There'll be higher levels that actually look over increasing numbers, extended periods of time, and start to look at put semantics in the context of syntax, and then you have higher levels that have representing the narrative, and then the genre of the book, say, that you're reading. So each level you're moving up, same principles, but playing out at different scales.
So when it comes to studying the brain, we have different methodologies, different ways we can do it. Like, for example, neuroimaging, lesion studies, brain stimulation studies, animal models, and so on. I would like to start by talking a little bit about neuroimaging, because that's an area where you've done lots of work. So what can we learn about the brain by studying it through imaging? What are the limitations of neuroimaging?
Well, neuroimaging, read as brain mapping, I think is a way of testing hypotheses about functional brain architectures, and we've spent 20 minutes talking about some really important aspects of functional brain architectures. But as we said at the beginning, I can't peer beneath your Markov blanket without breaking you. So if your Markov blanket goes away, you're no longer you. So that presents an interesting problem. If I want to understand how I work, I can't use my own brain, because if I use my own brain, I will disturb all the perception and action that underwrites me trying to understand and experiment my own. But I could study your brain. But can I? Well, no, I can't. Well, perhaps I could study things like your brain. Perhaps I could study the brain of your great grandparents after they've died, and I could do some neuroanatomy after and dissect dead brains. So that would be, and if you just look at the history of neuroscience, it all starts with dissecting dead ones, where the thing doesn't exist anymore. So its Markov blanket has disappeared, and you can intervene and actually look at the structure and get a lot of insights into the function simply by looking at the structure. So just discovering hierarchical organizations, just discovering the preponderance of connections in the brain. So if you just think about that, that's interesting from the point of view of that good regulator theorem I was saying before. If you were able to dissect a brain, you would be amazed that nearly all of it is wire. There's only a very small part of it, mostly on the surface, like a cauliflower, covered with the cortex, which literally means that that which is on the surface, which is just a few millimeters deep. That's where all your brain cells are. All the rest of it, to a certain approximation, is just wiring, and that wiring is very sparse. Mediated by axons that conduct or have influences over a whole range of distances, up to several centimeters in some instances with certain fasciculi, and they're able to conduct with high fidelity and influence other neurons by being wrapped in myelin, which is a fatty insulator like a cable, and that fatty substance looks white, so it's called white matter. So the cortex is grey matter, the interior, most of the interior, the connectivity is white matter. That is interesting because what it means is if you are a generative model of your world, then your world basically must be of the sort where there is action at a distance and it is quite sparse, which is interesting, isn't it? Because
by the way, sorry for interrupting you. What does the term sparse or sparsity mean in the context of neuroscience?
Well, it's used, I think, in the same context everywhere. It just means that, and it's can be used. It usually refers to distributions. So a very sparse distribution would, for example, be where there are a very, very small number of big things and a very large number of small things. When used in the context of connectivity, which is the sense in which we've been using it throughout this conversation, either in terms of coupling in random dynamical systems and causal inferences, or in terms of brain connections that are, if you like, the physical instantiation of those causal influences, then we're talking about, we can envisage a matrix, a big square with lots of elements where there's an entry when one thing is connected to another thing. So if everything was connected to everything, that matrix would be populated with non-zero elements everywhere, and it would be dense. So it would be a non-sparse matrix. On the other hand, if everything is just connected to one other thing, then for every column in that matrix, there'll just be one entry. So although you have n squared possible connections, there'll only be a small number in that particular simple example, just n connections. So that's a sparse matrix. So what people are looking for when they look at connectomes or connectivity or adjacency matrix in graph theory, they're looking for, or they expect to see sparse connections. So of all the possible connectivity, only a very small number of connections are actually evident or present. So the brain has billions of neurons. So you can imagine an enormous big connectivity matrix, sometimes called an adjacency matrix, that I'm next to you if I'm connected to you. A massive billions times billions of potential entries, but the actual number of connections is a tiny fraction of all the possible connections. And that's what people mean when they say sparse. People who are experts in this field, nowadays dubbed connectomics, say in terms of the connectivity, the brain's almost empty of all the possible ways it could be, wires you could have. There's hardly anything there. And yet, of course, it takes up most of the wiring, actually takes up most of the space. So that's what sparsity means. And it's an important point to pick up on, because again, this theme that the brain is or entails the model of the lived world, it means that your world has very sparse causal structure. And of course, that's exactly where we started with the definition of things in terms of Markov blankets. So if I live in a universe that is constituted by things, that just means I live in a universe with lots of Markov blankets at a particular scale. If I live in a universe with lots of Markov blankets at a particular scale, that means it has to be sparsely coupled. And if my self-organization in terms of synaptic plasticity is a way of learning that sparse, where those sparse connections or couplings are, that means that my brain should have a sparse connectivity, and it does. So sorry, we wandered away from your question about brain imaging, but I'm just saying that you can learn a lot about the anatomy. Just be able to dissect a dead brain, it tells you a lot about the world that this brain used to be in, and the principles, and the scale at which this brain was operating, and it also tells you about the different modalities. Then you move to neuropsychology. So after you had all the famous natural scientists doing the dissection of dead bodies, then came along the ability to do lesion experiments on animals, for example, or an electrical stimulation experiments. So there's a lot of work in the 17th and 18th century asking a really simple question: is the brain pluripotential in the sense that every capacity, perceptual or cognitive capacity, that we enjoy involves or entails every neuron in a distributed fashion? Or are certain parts of the brain specialized for particular functions? So, there were sort of, and this debate raged even into the 20th century in terms of sort of Lashley's law of mass action, for example. That if I take a little mouse brain and I just scoop out a thumbnail or less, does it matter where I do it in terms of what function I have now compromised in this little animal? And one could argue no, that it was a bad argument, because it does matter. But that was what people were trying to understand. Was there, and this became known subsequently as the principle of functional specialization or segregation, that different parts of our brain are specialized for modeling different modalities in different parts of the world, and different aspects of the world at different temporal scales, for example. So most of the compelling work in terms of lesioning studies usually certainly with humans, the only lesions that you could use were those that were occurred naturally, as in terms of strokes, for example, or if you were involved as a war medic, you had the opportunity to discover lesions caused by bullets, for example, in, say, World War One. That became known as neuropsychology. So neuropsychology just is understanding the deficits that follow from a lesion to the brain. You can then say, well, if I've lost this function, I have this, by appeal to this lesion deficit model, if I've lost this function when I've had a stroke here, whereas I've lost this function when I've had a stroke here, you've got a double dissociation. That's one of the main workhorses of neuropsychology. And that sort of means that that part of the brain might be specialized for this kind of function, whereas that might be specialized for another one. So you're starting to segregate the functional specialization anatomically. So it's also known as functional segregation. So functional segregation would be the anatomical segregation of functionally specialized brain areas. And we're talking about brain areas at different scales. It could be the entire lobe, the occipital lobe, say doing vision, right down to little thumbnail-sized patches of the brain, say V5, also known in animal research as MT, being specialized for visual motion. So this was, if you like, the whole set of really important questions pertaining to, is the functional specialization, is a functional segregation in the brain? We think there is, because look into all these beautiful neuropsychology experiments, all this very finessed neuroanatomy and tracing studies. Everything points to functional specialization, but no one knew. No one knew until brain imaging came along. It's strange, but before, really before the sort of the late 80s, early 90s, this was just a hypothesis. It was only when you could actually measure the entire brain doing one thing that you could say, yes, this part of the brain was involved in visual motion and it didn't activate anything else. And this part of the brain was involved in processing visual color. And it's not the visual motion area, and it didn't activate anything else. So it's only when you're able to do imaging proper, by which I'm assuming that your question is about being able to form pictures of the entire brain in action. Yeah. So at that point, all of these, unsurprising, but strictly speaking, all up until that time, functional specialization and segregation and all the theories about that attend in terms of functional brain architectures were just hypotheses. No one actually knew until you could actually measure the brain responding or executing a particular function or engage in a particular kind of perception, until you can actually see that and see the anatomical segregation in the images, that we knew that was the case. And having established the principle of functional specialization or segregation, the next stage was to turn to the second principle, which was which is in my world referred to as the principle of functional integration. So now you've got this notion, you've got lots of different sort of centers of anatomically segregated, specialized processing brain regions. Now you want to know, how do they talk to each other? How are the messages passed around? How does one system influence another or contextualize another? What is the nature of this distributed processing? And that really requires you to understand the connectivity. So we're back now to the adjacency matrices and the connective and the causal influences of one region on another region that is going to recapitulate or install that causal architecture out there. That it matters, when you're speaking, that I can either infer what you are saying through the movement of your lips, through the visual modality, or through my ears in terms of the sound waves that you produce. There's a common cause, and therefore there has to be part of the brain in which this audio-visual integration is mechanistically evinced through connections between, or through convergence into these amodal domain general regions through these hierarchical structures. So this then became the focus of decades of research still ongoing in brain imaging to understand the connectivity and how the connections underwrite patterns of activation and systems at different scales. So that understanding the integration of these functionally specialized regions was very important. For me, and many people like me, one important aspect of functional integration in the brain was this hierarchical structure. So the very first paper in cerebral cortex, the first issue, was a very famous Feldman Van Essen paper, just looking at the connectivity studies, usually in primates, so sort of post-mortem studies, looking at great detail about the nature and the lambda specificity of different connections, and they came up with a wiring diagram that was the visual hierarchy. And a lot of work since that time has now been trying to understand the hierarchical relationship in terms established by the connections by using brain imaging to measure not just which brain areas are activated, but can you infer the influence that this brain area has on this brain area.
Right. And so we've been talking a lot about brain imaging, but are there ways by which we can integrate the more coarse-grained approaches to the brain with the more fine-grained approaches, and, for example, integrate the smaller sort of microscopic aspects of brain physiology with the more abstract understanding of the mind, like what we have in psychiatry or psychology?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And in essence, yes, there is, that would be the holy grail of certainly translational neuroscience in the context of translating into a clinical context, neurology or psychiatry. To do that usefully, as you intimate, you really need to link the scales. So sometimes framed in terms of from molecules to behavior. I like from synapse to sentience. So how do you bridge that gap? If you want my honest and personal answer, you need to have a generative model of the brain. So we've been talking about the brain as a generative model, but a lot of the maths behind the free energy principle and that description of self-organization in the brain inherited from the problem of actually analyzing brain imaging data and integrating data at different scales and different modalities. And the secret behind it is to have a model of how you think the brain works that can generate predictions of the data that you would get if you measured it at this scale versus that scale. So what normally happens is that people specialize in a particular scale. So you can be a molecular biologist and work with all the delicate and sometimes overwhelming plurality of different intracellular mechanisms and biochemical pathways, or even the genetics, the genomics of all this. So the whole universe, just looking at not just one cell, but even mitochondria within one cell. There are people who know more than I could possibly know about the entire brain. Just about the dynamics and the structure of organelles and things like, I repeat, mitochondria in the cell, right through to ethologists, who just look at stigmergic, look at ant colonies, for example, sort of multiple individuals, or psychologists of a certain bent who are interested in the social neuroscience. So all of these people work at different scales, but in principle, you should be able to link the scales, and that means you have to have again another instance of this sort of hierarchical or scale-free modeling, which means you need to have the right principles. So just to come back to where we started, the raison d'etre for the free energy principle is to identify these scale-free principles that you should find operating at every level, so that you can start to link the levels. So just experimentally, what one is looking for is at a very, very fine scale to try and estimate certain dynamics, rate constants, connectivity structures, in a way that allows you now to constrain estimates in more elaborate, higher scale models of what's going on. So just to give you a concrete example, say take psychiatry. and you're predicating your understanding of psychiatry, say psychosis, in terms of a predisposition to hallucinations. And you can start to look for models, psychological models of hallucinations, and do brain scanning when people are hallucinating versus not hallucinating at a very sort of large scale level. And then start to say, does this kind of paradigm and the emergent brain activations and effective connectivity matter in terms of identifying people with and without, say, schizophrenia or some kind of organic psycho syndrome or synaptopathy.
What is synaptopathy? Sorry.
It's a pathology of synapses. So, so the connectivity we've been talking about is connections between nerve cells or neurons. Those connections come in many different flavors, and there are people who argue that there are also non-neuronal cells that are important in message passing and self-organization. But the primary way in which one nerve cell or population of nerve cells, neurons, talks to another population is through these axons, the wires. And these wires basically impinge upon receptors, dendritic trees of the recipient neuron, and the actual connection is very much like a little plug and socket. It's called a synapse. So it's a very, very small plug and socket that has an amazing physiology, and it can be tuned much like a transistor or modern day implementations of chips, but much more complicated than you'll find in a computer. So that's the synapse. A pathology of synaptic communication or transmission is a synaptopathy. That can go wrong because the molecular biology and the pharmacology, the neuropharmacology of synaptic transmission is the understanding of the biochemistry and the molecular biology and the genomics and the physiology of how one neuron nerve cell talks to another through these synapses. And it can go wrong in all sorts of ways. So a synaptopathy would be basically a failure of the synaptic communication. If you're a machine learning, it would be basically breaking the connection weights. Lots and lots of different ways in which it can be changed, usually associated with sort of neurodegenerative conditions, but also you can generalize the notion that because this synaptic communication involves neurotransmitters, and the neurotransmitters cause their effects in the postsynaptic cell by latching onto receptors. Those receptors are the targets of drugs. So nearly all, in fact, all the drugs that we use, nearly all the drugs that we use in neurology and psychiatry are those drugs that affect synaptic transmission. Yeah. Interestingly, not to usually directly cause a response, but to attenuate or augment the impact of an existing input. So it's like switching a gain on the synaptic connections, much in the way that we could imagine increasing the gain on connectivity in the brain by deploying attention. Attending over here as opposed to over there means that I can use certain mechanisms, usually neuromodulatory mechanisms, to modulate the gain of the synaptic transmission, sometimes known as postsynaptic gain or sensitivity. So if those systems go wrong, then you've got now a very small scale, and you understand the mechanics because you've done all the neuropharmacology and the molecular biology, and I've studied these cells in context in microcircuits. If you understand that, you've now got a link between the macro scale belief updating that underlies a hallucination and what could possibly cause the difference in the propensity for illusory or hallucinatory perception in this group of people versus that group of people, predicated on an understanding of the molecular biology or the drug status of these people, because you start to understand the biophysics of the message passing, that ultimately that just is the neural dynamics of the internal states. But because you've now got a principled account of how the internal dynamics can manifest in terms of perception, you've now got an explanation at the level of perception and hallucinations and belief updating and failures of belief updating, like delusions, or in fact, if you think about it, nearly every psychiatric syndrome can be thought of as some kind of false inference. Whether it's anorexia nervosa, and I falsely infer that I am much fatter than I am, so dysmorphophobia. So it's quite natural if I infer and believe that I'm grossly obese, then it's quite understandable that I'm going to be very resistant to overeating. Through to delusional systems of paranoia, for example. If I falsely infer that you have some antagonistic view, or I falsely infer that the TV presenter is actually talking to me personally, a failure of attribution, another kind of false inference, right through to the inferences that need new learning. If we lose a loved one in our lives, the grief reaction requires a lot of new learning, which means that for a certain amount of time, you will be making false inferences. I expect my daily life to be like this, and the loved one is not there. You have to completely relearn a new world model or a new generative model where that person is no longer there. That can be very painful. And involve lots of mistakes and high free energy, which you try to repair by learning a new way of life, slowly coming to terms with what has happened.
Could that also apply to depression? And in this case, depression, what would it be like? Would it be sort of having pessimistic generative models of the world or something like that?
Yeah, there are lots of interesting accounts of depression under the free energy principle, or more particularly sort of active inference, focusing on different aspects of it. There is an argument that depression is not false inference, in the sense that it's actually veridical. The very fact that we have depression after millennia of natural selection means that there must be something good about the ability to be depressed. And of course, if you read depression in a very simple way as avoidance behavior that restricts, that precludes putting yourself in situations where you will be surprised or hurt or damaged or embarrassed or upset in some way, then it can be very protective. So it's quite good to be depressed and withdrawn in situations where, if you didn't withdraw from this, if you didn't preclude or preclude that interaction, you could actually end up being more surprised and agitated or upset than if you did. The problem with depression is when that Bayes optimal response, active inference response, outlives the circumstances that caused it. So say I have a bad experience. You can see how the argument could be extended to all sorts of phobias and obsession compulsive disorder. But let's just simplistically say I have a very bad experience. That means that if I leave my house, I am going to be very surprised by something awful happening, whether it's a socially awful thing, or emotionally awful thing, or physically awful thing. I'm going to feel excruciating pain, or feel terrified, have a panic attack. If I leave the house, this will happen to me because it happened to me once. Therefore, this is the kind of thing I don't do, because I don't have panic attacks, and I don't get upset by other people. I have this kind of self model. Therefore, it's highly unlikely that something like me will leave the house. So I end up socially withdrawn. I avoid social media, for example. And that can be very functional if you have, if it's actually quite dangerous out there. But now, say the world changes, and all your friends are missing you, and they don't know where you are, but you don't have the opportunity to revise your prior beliefs that if I go outside, I'm going to get hurt. Simply because your behavior has prevented you from self-evidencing, from gathering evidence to revise your self-model or your model of the consequences of your behavior. So there are some certain pernicious responses, active inference, that mean you can never get out of that behavior because you're not exploring, you're not always seeking evidence for this way of being and that way of being. So this is sometimes framed in terms of literally getting stuck in a rut, because you can't get out of the rut, you can't get out of the valley, because you've got no evidence that's going to cause prediction errors to drive to change your mind. So what you need to do in these situations, such as depression, is to basically make the sides of the valley shallower, to allow people to escape again, and to allow the prediction errors to drive, to seek out information, to resolve uncertainty, to where uncertainty is expected surprise and expected free energy. And to do that, you can do it in one of two ways. You can either create an environment where the patient feels safe, so that they can explore different ways of interacting. And you'd be thinking about sort of dyadic, either cognitive behavioral therapy or psychotherapy, talking therapy, and psychoanalysis. Or you can think about doing it chemically. If you understand the molecular biology, if you understand how we encode the precision, the conviction, the depth of our, I'm stuck in this rut and I've got no latitude to move. So you've got very, very precise beliefs that are holding you in place. If you understand what neurochemically and biophysically is representing that particular belief, which is, in this instance, about the precision of your conviction that this is the way I behave, then you can actually give drugs to try and relax that, to try and relax the constraints, so people can start to explore other ways. So you can understand a lot of pharmacotherapy in terms of the retuning, the encoding of uncertainty or precision, which is, if you remember, that sort of slow but not very fast sort of thing between inference and learning. So this is the contextual inference, this is the attention, this is the way that we encode uncertainty in the brain. And if surprise, expected surprise, is uncertainty, which it is, self-information is expected self-information, average self-information is entropy. Put in layman's language, or the vernacular, would be basically the surprise I expect is uncertainty. Then I'm in the, I am always in the game of reducing uncertainty under the free energy principle, reducing expected surprise. But to do that, I've also got to recognize my level of uncertainty, my level of surprise, or average surprise, which brings us back to this sort of crucial ability to recognize the context in terms of how confident I am in my beliefs. And that relates at the microscopic, on the molecular level, to synaptic efficacy and postsynaptic gain and all the neuromodulation that we've been talking about.
So, Dr. Friston, I would really love to get into other topics, like, for example, the application of active inference to explaining or understanding certain social phenomena, like social conformity, and then I would like to ask you about culture. But I'm just seeing that we've already done 2 hours. So do you think it would be better for us to do it again another time?
I would be very happy to come back and do all those. Yes, we have to come back a few times to do all that.
Yeah,
Yes, no,
because if we get into the topic of social expectations, culture, and all of that, we will be here for another 2 hours probably.
no, yes, if not longer. No, I now need to go and neuromodulate and have a nice cigarette and cup of coffee to think about what we've been talking about.
Great. So just before we finish this interview, are there any places on the internet where people can find your work?
Yes, there are. I mean, it's not really my work. I mean, the active inference is now, growing well beyond even that which I know about. So there's a large literature in all of the fields that we've spoke about. So I think you just Google active inference but specifically there's something called the Active Inference Institute. And it's based in California, and it provides an excellent resource of teaching materials and possible live streams and mentorship for people who are interested in sharing ideas or just learning about how active inference and its various fields of application. There's also international workshops where the community gets together and tell each other what's happening and what's exciting in the field. So Active Inference Institute, but otherwise you're just looking at the theoretical neurobiology literature in the field of your inquiry. Don't necessarily look for my name, as I say. It's gone past me. I'm now an admiring spectator of the applications.
Great. So, look, this has been a really fascinating conversation. We've covered a lot of ground when it comes to the free energy principle, nervous systems, active inference. So, I'm very much looking forward to our next talk.
Excellent. I look forward to that.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavla Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht, A special thanks to my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets and Rosie. Thank you for all.